Part 2. Balkanization. As I got further down this weird f***ing rabbit hole, I made some friends online who were doing the same thing I was, more or less, and we joined forces to improve our collective ability to know what the f*** we were looking at online, because things just got weirder and weirder. Like, for example, we all started noticing really bizarre digital behaviors from a lot of the accounts we were following within conservative Facebook groups. First, a lot of the posts were written in like really bad English, which made us suspect that they weren't being written by people whose first language was English. This was really odd because these groups tended to have like pretty xenophobic viewpoints espoused like pretty regularly. The second was this thing where one particular account would prompt group members to say something like, "Thank you, President Trump," and hundreds of comments would pop up saying exactly that within exact 1-minute intervals into all hours of the night when people in the US would presumably be asleep. Third, certain accounts linked exclusively to really weird, shitty WordPress websites using news media layout templates, but everything was over-the-top clickbait and fake news. Obama signs executive order banning the Pledge of Allegiance in schools nationwide. That particular story had over 2 million engagements. So it wasn't really hard to figure this out. You just had to use something called a whois tool where you enter in a website and it shows you the owner of the domain, but we found that most of these websites were owned by people in Macedonia. And this was all when Russiagate was a really hot topic, so since Macedonia is in the Balkans, and the Balkans is like kind of close to Russia, we thought, oh man, we're looking at Russian bots. It's fucking Russian bots. So for a short time, I began kind of sounding like one of those generic liberals who would claim that online Trump supporters were all just a bunch of Russian bots. But that faded once I realized it's actually pretty hard to distinguish between things like a real account, a hacked account, which is like a real account that was hacked because it hasn't been used for a while and the password was easy to get or whatever, and automated or bot accounts. And there's like a relatively big variety of these kinds of accounts. So since I realized it's kind of hard to distinguish between what's real and fake, I then realized that I'd actually gotten myself into something totally different from what I initially intended. What I had intended to do was to better understand Trump supporters and the American right. What I ended up doing was just like swimming around in a weird ecosystem of fake shit, and I didn't understand it for a while, and in fact I was just kind of bewildered. Then came along this dude named June Cho. Meet June. Pretty cool guy. He's into guns, plays a lot of video games. He wrote a series of Medium articles on Russian information warfare in 2018, and I do think that June's a bit of a genius, although I don't trust the US intelligence community as much as he does. In any case, his writings really helped me understand what I was actually looking at once I found myself in this weird ecosystem of digital influence operations. I'll link June's articles in the description so you can read them yourself, but he breaks down how misinformation, disinformation, and propaganda work online nowadays, both from a psychological and a technological perspective. This phrase in particular has stood out to me ever since I first read it years ago in his series of Medium articles.
Fake news is a weapon that works by infecting personal identity.
Just say it again.
Fake news is a weapon that works by infecting personal identity.
The more I studied these digital operations, the more it became clear that the whole thing was about money. Macedonian internet nerds just set up elaborate networks using Facebook's existing design framework to get as much traffic as possible to their websites, which were monetized through advertising revenue. So the more people who clicked their fake news stories online, the more money they made. Plus, they obviously had access to botnets, which is a fancy term for like a big network of automated social media accounts, and they programmed these botnets to boost their content into Facebook groups and news feeds by artificially engaging content with likes, comments, and shares. The intention of these complex operations was to create the manufactured appearance of viral content, which then made real people think, well, wow, this has been shared thousands of times, it must be important, I should click on it and share it, which further pushed the content around and maximized the Macedonian internet nerds' profits. But I also wondered at this point why all this fake news was targeting American right-wingers and not left-wingers. Then this kind of voice went off in my head like, well, I'm a left-winger, and I'm pretty confident that I'm not susceptible to all this fake shit, right? And right around the time that I started wondering about this, like, was I being influenced in the same way? The US Congress released a ton of content that the Russian Information Warfare Operations Team Internet Research Agency had been using to f*** with all of us as Americans during the 2016 election cycle. And the thing is, they didn't just target the American right. They also amplified Black Lives Matter content, and Bernie content, and LGBT content. So now I was wrestling with trying to figure out, like, why the Russian military was going out of its way to heavily influence both left and right-wing people within the US, apparently to influence our voting behaviors. And meanwhile, some random random Macedonian dudes were engaged in similar behavior, seemingly just because it was profitable. But then I was also wondering, were these Macedonians some sort of outsourced operation that Russia was paying? Was the Republican Party involved? Was the Democratic Party involved? Steve Bannon and the Cambridge Analytica gang? This was a bit of a dark time for me in terms of mental health. I was using a fake Facebook account to study other fake Facebook accounts, trying to figure out which accounts were real, and coming up with a bunch of wild conspiracy theories which made no sense to anybody in my actual real life when I tried to explain it to them. So I kept retreating further and further into online engagement with fake knowing it was fake and not really knowing what to think about any of it. Some of this started to make a bit more sense for me after I watched Adam Curtis's documentary Hypernormalization, and in particular, the breakdown of this avant-garde Russian political strategist weirdo named Surkov.
Surkov turned Russian politics into a bewildering, constantly changing piece of theatre. He used Kremlin money to sponsor all kinds of groups, from mass anti-fascist youth organisations to the very opposite, neo-Nazi skinheads. And liberal human rights groups who then attacked the government. Surkov even backed whole political parties that were opposed to President Putin. But the key thing was that Surkov then let it be known that this was what he was doing, which meant that no one was sure what was real or what was fake in modern Russia. As one journalist put it, it's a strategy of power that keeps any opposition constantly confused. A ceaseless shape-shifting that is unstoppable because it is indefinable.
And so, while I think that Russia as a nation-state is doing some pretty shady shit these days, what I learned that what they're doing is just amplifying two sides of a conflict in order to destabilize and control both sides. It sounded kind of like what I know about the history of the CIA. The US military spent an estimated $8 trillion over the course of about 45 years to win the Cold War, and while most of this was for the nuclear arms race and dozens of proxy wars throughout South America, Asia, and the Middle East to stop the spread of communism, a lot of it was CIA operations intended to collapse the USSR from within. One example was Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which were fake radio stations funded by the CIA, running 24 hours a day with 20 languages of everything they were broadcasting for decades, specifically trying to amplify dissident voices within the USSR.
This is Radio Liberty, an independent radio network sponsored and supported by the American Committee for Liberation, a group of private American citizens devoted to aiding the oppressed peoples of the Soviet Union bring about a democratic government in their homeland. Although the station features a variety of programs, news is the staple of its broadcast fare. Uncensored news. And so, day in, day out, Radio Liberty, broadcasting in 18 languages, continues its democratic education for the peoples of the USSR.
The US looked for and exploited existing divisions within the USSR along lines such as ethnicity, religion, nationality.
Fake news is a weapon that works by infecting personal identity.
And financed any group promoting anti-communist sentiments along those lines. The goal was to see where solidarity among people could be broken into smaller pieces. Okay, so you probably noticed a few minutes ago I said part 2, Balkanization. So why is that? Well, so Macedonia is in the Balkans, so that's easy, right? But the term Balkanization refers to a process whereby regions such as nation states break up into smaller units, usually hostile toward each other across ethnic or cultural lines. People used the term Balkanization to refer to what happened to basically all of Central and Eastern Europe in the 1980s and 1990s because the USSR broke apart into smaller countries, many of which are now hostile toward each other. Russia, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Armenia, Estonia, Latvia, and a few others. And Yugoslavia, which was also like this big federation, they used something called market socialism, which was different than the USSR's model, and they broke up into Serbia, Montenegro, Kosovo, Bosnia, Macedonia, and a few others. So it's almost funny to me now to to consider that the US spent trillions of dollars to fight socialism over half a century using propaganda tools like quote-unquote radio liberty, and 40 years later, a handful of jaded, nihilistic Macedonian teenagers are making millions of dollars trolling Americans with websites like usalibertypress.com.
If you want to see how the free market really works, this is the place to come.
But this notion of individual liberty and freedom, and defining these things in American terms through decades of propaganda pummeled into these people's heads, making them think of themselves not as a unified proletariat working to usher in a better world by progressing beyond capitalism, and instead making them see themselves as segregated identities who must fight each other endlessly across borders of division. I mean, you gotta wonder what might happen if that set of ideas spreads all over the world instead of communism.
What does being black mean to you? And why? Why do you want to be black?
Well, I think that, sometimes how we feel is more powerful than how we're born. Blackness can be defined as philosophical, cultural, biological.
But if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.